Welcome everyone to our panel reviewing the current state of Zero Trust. We have some excellent CSA and industry experts grouped together today to talk about Zero Trust. In recent years, there's been a lot of security incidents that demonstrate that the traditional trust-based castle and moat physical perimeter security architecture is ineffective. And in the current era of decentralized cloud computing and remote workforce, where few assets and users are actually inside the castle, it's just not working anymore. And more increasingly sophisticated threat actors are increasingly adept at exploiting any exposed technical human vulnerability in this modern, highly distributed environment. And successful attacks generally exploit trust in some manner, which makes trust a vulnerability that we need to mitigate and manage. And that's what Zero Trust is all about, is doing that. So in Zero Trust, it's a holistic enterprise security strategy that encompasses cloud, multi-cloud, all different cloud service models, internal and external partner stakeholder users, organizational BYOD endpoints, on-prem and hybrid systems, and it's inclusive of both operational technology and IoT. From what I've seen personally, Zero Trust is probably the most relevant and comprehensive enterprise security strategy currently available for our current environment and threat landscapes. But because of its scope, it's been compared to an elephant that can only be grasped in pieces and has to be implemented incrementally, and preferably, of course, in a risk-based and iterative manner. So let's talk a little bit about what's new and hot in the Zero Trust space. So first, from the CSA perspective, I'd note that we're hosting our second annual Zero Trust Summit on November 15th and 16th, and that's available for registration today. We've had a number of recent webinars focusing on the CISA Zero Trust security model, and comparing and contrasting it with DoD and the Forrester model and that sort of thing. Those have been very interesting and informative. There's a new one that's just coming out on the 13th of October with DoD, and some recent Zero Trust research publications that, building on our earlier portfolio of software-defined perimeter and more broader Zero Trust strategy guidance. So one is Zero Trust Principles and Guidance for IAM, Zero Trust Guiding Principles, and Communicating the Business Value of Zero Trust. And behind that, we have a whole pipeline of additional research that's under development. We've also produced some Zero Trust training program. There are 6 courses currently available, with a 7th coming shortly, along with a certification exam. And in the broader industry, there's been a number of recent publications, all of which are listed on the CSA Zero Trust Resource Hub. One that we rely on heavily is the NSTAC report to the US President on Zero Trust and Trusted Identity Management. It gives a good overview of the Zero Trust landscape, good Zero Trust background, and it introduces a very simple, repeatable 5-step Zero Trust implementation methodology. There's also the US Department of Defense's recent Zero Trust strategy and roadmap that builds on the earlier reference architecture. And then also of keen interest is the recently published CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model version 2 that came out in April. And that was the subject of the webinar that's coming out on the 13th, is comparing and contrasting that with the DoD model. And there's also been some recent guidance from NIST and NCCOE, such as 800-207A on Zero Trust architecture for multi-cloud environments, and some other NCCOE Zero Trust architectural guidance, and a broad array of other publications, recordings, and several good Zero Trust books as well, some written by folks who are on this call. Also, in terms of lit drivers in recent times for Zero Trust adoption, there's been increasingly sophisticated threat actors and evolving threat vectors, and including some attacks potentially leveraging AI are a big concern these days, resulting in increasing numbers and severity of ransomware attacks, increasing number of attacks on operational technology and IoT, and including some involving nation-state actors. And there's increasing levels of cyber regulation, more and more liability for folks in cybersecurity roles like CISOs. And then the costs of cyber insurance have been increasing, if you can even get it. And all of this is driving increasing levels of urgency, interest in, and adoption of zero trust, both the US and internationally. So to help organizations with useful information to help meet these challenges, our experts today will discuss the current state of zero trust planning and guidance, both for public and private sectors in the US and internationally. So I'd like to introduce John Kindervag, the creator of Zero Trust and chief evangelist at Illumio. Hi, John.
Hey.
And, Jason Garbus, who's one of the co-chairs of the CISA Zero Trust Working Group, and he's the principal and founder of Numberline Security.
Hello.
Jennifer Manella, founder and principal advisor of Vision Security.
Hey, everybody. Hi, Eric.
Hi. And Shruti Kulkarni, cybersecurity architect and CISA Zero Trust Working Group co-leader.
Hi, everybody.
So let's start off with a little bit of background on zero trust. So let's start with a question for John in terms of what is zero trust. So you brief, set the table with a definition, and then what are some of the key security drivers these days encouraging organizations to implement zero trust?
Yeah, so zero trust has been around a lot longer than people think. A lot of times, if they're just touching on it, but I wrote the first report back in 2010 and gave the first speech in 2008. I don't even know how to say that. 28? No, 2008 is how you would appropriately say that, I guess. So I've been working on it for a long time. But zero trust is a cybersecurity strategy, right? So it's a big idea that we're going to use to achieve an ultimate goal. And it's a strategy designed to do two things. One is to stop data breaches. Data is the thing that's most valuable to companies. And it's the only thing, if there's a data breach, that can get the CEO fired, right? CEOs don't get fired for ransomware attacks, they fire CISOs. But if there's a data breach, it's highly likely that they're going to get fired. So data is a very important thing. There's a lot of regulations around it, and those regulators define a breach not as if somebody gets into your environment, but if somebody exfiltrates that data that is regulated or sensitive. So we're trying to stop data breaches. That's the first thing. And then we're trying to make other cybersecurity attacks unsuccessful. There's really just two types of cybersecurity attacks, successful ones and unsuccessful ones. And so we can make them unsuccessful because, as Eric already mentioned, almost every single cybersecurity attack that's successful leverages a broken trust model. So by eliminating the concept of trust from digital systems, we can make a huge difference in our organizations. And so that's the basic definition of zero trust. It's not about a product. It's not about technology in any way. We, of course, use it. It is a strategy designed to resonate to the highest levels of any organization and yet be tactically implementable using commercially available off-the-shelf technology at whatever state it's in. Now, I purposely decoupled the strategy and tactics back in the day because I understood the strategy would never really need to change. Strategies don't change much, but the tactics would. I mean, the technology would always get better and better and better. And I was counting on that, and that turned out to be true. So this has become a global movement. I've been all over the world because of Zero Trust, and it's an honor to be part of this working group and work with the Cloud Security Alliance, who provides so much great resources to its membership and the cybersecurity community at large.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Have there been factors influencing sort of increasing levels of interest in adoption in zero trust of late?
Well, the big factor that there were two big things that really drove it. One was the target data breach. So I break cybersecurity down into two eras: BT, before target, and AT, after target, right? So cybersecurity didn't really start, in my opinion, until after the target breach, because that got executive attention. And then there was a second event called the OPM data breach. You may have heard of that. Some people haven't because they're not tied into what happens in the US federal government. But this was a data breach that exposed or stole the information of everybody who had clearances in the US federal government. And this was a thing that really got the attention of the government, led to the Congress doing some reports on it, issuing some I don't know, directives, I guess, for OMB to do more work on it, and that led to the presidential executive order. That was the tipping point because that changed the incentive structure and said it's okay to talk about zero trust. It used to be I would do work with people and I'd try to get them to do a webinar, be on a stage, do a case study, and they would say, yeah, I'd love to, and then their PR or legal team would say, no, we can't do that because that'll put a target on our back. And so we used to joke that zero trust was like Fight Club. The first rule is you don't talk about it. And now everybody's talking about it. So that's cool. So we're at least heading in the right direction. And then when we see successful attacks, ransomware attacks like we've been seeing right now, that's what's visible. But what's not visible is all the times that zero trust has stopped these things. So being in my role, I get to get that feedback from customers who said, hey, here's what happened, and somebody tried to do this, and because we had a zero trust environment in that area for that particular protect surface, we stopped this particular attack that if it would have been successful would have been devastating. So it's like a lot of things, it's hard to see the effectiveness, but I can tell you that the reason the president wrote his executive order is that those people who were advising him from the government cyber side could see the effectiveness in environments that had been built in a zero trust manner.
I think from my perspective, Eric, there's been increasing, obviously, awareness in on the enterprise side in terms of this is an important new strategy to take because it breaks down. Number one, it compensates for the weaknesses in traditional architectures, and it breaks down the barriers and the gaps that have existed across the different layers. And there's a recognition that to do zero trust properly, you need to have contextual information. You need to be able to use that at the network layer, at the identity layer, at the application layer, and have this holistic policy that is adaptive and sensitive to things in your environment. And that's one of the reasons that I think there's been such a groundswell of adoption for it.
Excellent, thank you. And I found John's point interesting that you're invisible when you're successful, right? Because those are the things you don't hear about. Interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, that's the frustrating part is I hear all the time, oh, it doesn't work. But I can't share with you the screenshots that people send to me that go, look at what happened. This thing was stopped automatically without us doing anything because there was no policy that allowed it to happen. Wow, this is great. So it's hard to make that case conceptually.
Yep, definitely. So there's been a lot of evolution in the sort of the thinking, the published guidance around zero trust lately. Jason, what have you seen in that regard?
So in the intro, Eric, you talked a lot about kind of an enumeration of those things. I would definitely encourage folks, if they haven't, to look at some of the foundational documents like NIST Zero Trust Architecture, which is Special Application 800-207, the more recent NSTAC report that John was a big contributor and leader for. There's also been, of course, continued ongoing work from NIST on the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. They're doing a multi-vendor lab proof of concept and reference architecture. So that work is ongoing. And then, as you mentioned, there's additional things coming out of other U.S. government areas. The NSA has issued some guidance, the U.S. Department of Defense. And of course, independently, the CISA has been a leader in this area with the publication of some of the documents you mentioned, such as Zero Trust Guiding Principles, Zero Trust and Identity and Access Management, and communicating the business value of Zero Trust, with more in the pipeline that Jennifer and Shruti and others are leading the development of. So I would encourage listeners to do some research and reading on that, get comfortable with these terms, and to use that to start their own zero trust journeys internally.
And what have you been seeing in terms of the sort of evolution or refinement of the guidance around sort of incrementally working your way up like the maturity model ladder and that sort of thing to give folks a sort of a roadmap for that iterative or incremental implementation?
There's a lot of ongoing work and conversations around that. And as you mentioned, CISA published version 2 of the Zero Trust Maturity Model just a few months ago. And that's been very well received in the industry as a framework. And I encourage people to read through that and internalize that and to use that as a way to measure their own internal maturity, but to also recognize that that is one goal, right? Advancing up those pillars and improving your security, but it shouldn't be, I wouldn't say even the primary goal. The primary goal needs to be securely allowing the business to accomplish its mission, and security needs to support that and to tie the projects and the deliverables to things that incrementally and rapidly deliver business value. Because if all you're doing is focusing on security, you never understand the business or the business priority, you're going to be pushing a rock uphill a long time versus getting support of the business and pushing a rock downhill.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Okay. So
It's easy to push a rock downhill, by the way. So
that's what I'm saying.
yeah, I know. I was just pondering that, pushing a rock downhill. I'll just let it roll. And that's what happens when you get the support of the business, right? You can't go, I'm not going to do this because your boss's boss has decided it's going to be done. So the rock is moving, and what you want to do is not push it downhill. You want to make sure you're not in its path as it's coming down and it's going to roll over the top of you.
Right.
You want to be surfing the rock or the landslide downhill. I was talking to an enterprise earlier today, and they're making an acquisition, and this is a perfect opportunity for them to ride that wave and integrate those networks and those people properly.
Yeah.
Because the business is spending millions of dollars on this acquisition. So let's do it right, folks.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So we touched a little bit earlier on some of the escalating threats to organizations. Could we talk a little bit more about some of the ones that are specific to sort of OT, IoT, industrial control systems, and critical infrastructure? JJ, could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm sorry. I have this picture of like a cartoon version of John and Wile E. Coyote and this giant boulder rolling down the hill at this point. So my cheeks hurt from laughing. Yeah, critical infrastructure has been pretty interesting. So out of the 16 or so sectors of critical infrastructure, at least here in the US and similar structures in other countries, in the past 20 years, I've worked with about 13 of them that entire time. So it's been really interesting watching the evolution of the thought process and some of what you described in the opening and what John has already described with some of the different threat actors and motivations. So whether it's generative AI or some of these more advanced attacks that we're seeing, I think what we're kind of dealing with is both this constant conflict of guidance for critical infrastructure, and especially the environments that have operational technology. Because on the one hand, we have a lot of vendors and some security professionals who are saying, hey, we need to talk about the convergence of OT and IT environments that, of course, operate very differently. And then we have a large section of professionals that work exclusively in the OT space, guiding us strongly to segment them as much as possible and to move away from this convergence and further segment and diverge those entities, at least at the technical level, when we get into actually, the way the network is connected and segmented. So there's a lot of this tug of war about what should we do. We have challenges because these industries are targets. So we have, whether it's a critical infrastructure that by definition is critical to providing services to the communities, we all like water and power, or they're targeted because maybe it's a large venue. And I know John's had some interesting casino experiences. So we have this opportunity for the attackers to find these valuable targets, and often they're much softer and squishier than our traditional IT environments. And there's also just a lack of really meaningful guidance in that space. So I think we have enough challenges securing traditional IT, enterprise IT networks, but as soon as we get off of, and I'm just going to kind of chunk this into within the IT environment, a lot of times with our endpoints, when we're talking about the protect surfaces or the data, it's as easy as slapping on some software and some agents because those are very configurable. We can get very granular policy controls. And when we move into OT and the operational technology where there are cyber physical assets or IoT with Internet of Things and all of the manifestations of that, we don't have the luxury of just slapping an agent on something. And in fact, in many cases, we can't even necessarily really put a software-defined networking solution in place. I mean, you can, but it's not just a, hey, no brainer, rip it out and here we go. So we have that. And then, Eric, that you talked about with some of the changes in the attack methodologies, and also new attackers and new motives. So we're dealing with this whole shifting landscape of, we're trying to just wrap our heads around what we have and what we can do with it, how to integrate that, at least at the policy level for incident response with the rest of the organizations, and kind of get everybody on the same page. But these environments are just very different than what we're used to protecting.
But I would say, right, that there are some battles that are being fought, having worked with a lot of the big vendors for the OT technology, the HMIs, the PLCs, all that kind of stuff. They would all agree that there is a convergence of IT and OT at the transport layer. I mean, you're going to run it on the same network. You're not going to build a separate network anymore. You're going to, it all transports the same way. Now, the device itself becomes a little bit problematic, because you are correct. You can't do anything to the HMI, the PLC, whatever the OT, IoT device is. I did work on smart meters, which is the most misnamed product ever, because they're really dumb. That you can't do anything with them. Literally, we ended up trying to protect the power company from the smart meters, because everybody was afraid that they would attack them. And this was before like the Mirai botnet, which was that kind of an attack. So when we look at that kind of thing, we can still take the concepts of zero trust, protect surfaces, micro perimeters, and use different kinds of technology, not just endpoint technology, to control that. And I myself have done it a number of times for a number of large organizations in the areas of manufacturing, done some casinos, power, those kinds of things. But one of the great examples of this was in Finland. I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago. I don't remember exactly, but the Finnish power grid went down in winter. And from what I hear, it gets cold in Finland in the winter, so you don't want to be without electricity to warm your house. And they were really struggling, and their solution was to unplug the grid from the internet, and everything came back up, right? And I remember being at an event, a Forrester event, where Marcus Raynham, who is a luminary in the industry, if you haven't heard of him, he was one of the guys who created one of the original firewalls, and he was talking about how there was the unintended consequences of taking SCADA devices and attaching them to the internet, right? So the idea was, well, it'll be easier to manage, but his view was, but it'll be easier to attack at the same time. And so we're still having that same conversation, but I think zero trust can go a long way to solving those things. Although I would agree with you, there's some old school folks who don't want it to happen. It's not that it can't happen, it's more that they don't want it to happen because it disrupts the way in which those people have done things. And the number one objection to zero trust has always been, that's not the way we've always done things. I've heard that now for 15 years. And my answer was, yeah, it's not, but the way we've been doing it hasn't worked. So let's try something new.
Yeah. And I'll just toss it. I think we'll have some good discussions. Eric will talk about this later, but we do have the Zero Trust Summit coming up in November. And I'm happy to be helping with a lot of the content around the critical infrastructure part of that track. And so I agree with you that there is this friction of adoption of just, it is hard for people that are juggling a lot to take on something new and learn something new and kind of retrain their brain, not just on a specific tool set, but in how they're thinking. But we do have a lot of OT environments are simply very under-maintained Windows machines that we can't directly patch in the way that we have implemented them right now. So we do have these very squishy centers that we have to treat differently, and we're not just tossing them on our standard IT data networks. At least I hope we're not. There are people that are doing that. We are trying to move away from that and put some protection around that, at least in the interim. But we'll have more conversations about that soon. It'll be fun.
Excellent. And you're also working on documenting some guidance for that for OT, right?
Yes, sir.
Excellent.
And there is some convergence already happening. There's the new 62443. What would we call that? From IEC, ISA. Is that would you consider that, JJ, a standard, or what's that? Is that a guidance concept? I mean, how are everybody in that world defining it?
Yeah, it's a suite of guidance and conformance around, some of it's aimed at the actual asset owners, so the professionals and operators that are using and maintaining that equipment. Some of it is aimed at the service providers who are participating in the maintenance in different ways, and then a lot of it is aimed at the actual manufacturers of that technology. So it's a multi-tiered kind of suite of guidance, and some of it is written as a standard that it's normative, as in, thou shalt do things, and then there are technical references that are more informative about best practices and options for ways to do things. And it's pretty robust. So it ties into a lot of our normal frameworks like NIST that we use on the IT side.
And so I'm seeing some convergence there with Zero Trust. In working with some of the authors of that document, they pointed out to me that the concept of a conduit, which is how policy is created for this, is aligned exactly with what I call a Kipling method policy in Zero Trust: the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So we can define these granular rules on how a particular ICS type of protocol, for example, gets access to that legacy operating system that has a PLC in it, and it can't be upgraded because the vendor is not going to make a new driver for it. There's no money in that, but the company who is running that PLC is not going to change out all of these things into new versions, because that is just a cost that they don't want to absorb when it's working. So you've got kind of that inherent conflict there, and we can, I think, do a pretty decent job of solving that conflict through adopting a Zero Trust strategy to the problem.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm looking forward to more conversations around this whole subject at our Zero Trust Summit, as JJ mentioned. So let's step on to the next topic about some more practical implementation guidance for Zero Trust. In the CISA, we've been leveraging the NSTAC report to the President on Zero Trust as one of our foundational documents, and it does provide a good overview and background of some of the different guidance that's out there, some action items, and introduces a simple sort of repeatable 5-step Zero Trust implementation methodology that I think was largely your handiwork, right, John?
Yeah, I did that back in the Forrester days when I was, at one time I was the only person in the world doing Zero Trust. So I got to make a lot of the mistakes myself, and then write about them and tell people about the mistakes so that you don't have to make the same mistakes I did. And that's where the 5-step model came out. So I talk about defining the protect surface. Originally, that was called define your data in the original version of the report. But I realized, or actually customers pointed out to me, that they had lots of things other than data that they wanted to protect in a Zero Trust manner, including things like OT assets, including applications, servers, all kinds of things. So I came up with the idea of the protect surface, which is the inversion of the attack surface. Instead of trying to shrink the attack surface, which actually just grows like the universe, it expands constantly, we can shrink it down by inverting the problem and focusing on the protect surface. What do we need to protect? General Greg Toohill over at CERT likes to quote Frederick the Great, who once said, if you try to protect everything, you protect nothing. So, okay, what are we going to protect? That's the first step. Define the protect surface. The second step is map the transaction flows. How does the system work together as a system? And this came out of some mistakes that I made, where I brought some important applications down because we didn't understand the system, and we kind of bricked some things because there was nobody there who had the institutional knowledge to say, don't do this, don't put that there. So we need to understand that before we go and deploy the solution. And then the third step is architect the environment. And so every zero trust environment should be tailor-made for the protect surface. So people ask me, where do I put product X or widget Y? Well, what are you trying to protect? Because that's going to determine how you architect it. And I know in the old days, we always started with a reference architecture, but that was because we were designing everything from the outside in. But in zero trust, we start at the inside and move outward. That's one of the key principles. So step 3 is creating the architecture. Step 4 is creating the policy, because the technology that I deploy is only as good as the quality of the policy that I create. And then step 5 is to monitor and maintain that, to take all the telemetry and re-inject it back into the system so we can create learnings where we can improve the system over time. This is known as anti-fragility. There's a book by Taleb called Anti-Fragile, where he talks about how systems can get stronger and stronger when they're under stressors. And the attacks are stressors that we can learn from and build anti-fragile environments that get better and better over time. So that simple 5-step process should guide your zero trust journey. And I found people who leverage that 5-step model are generally very successful. People who ignore it generally are not successful in their zero trust environment. And so I would encourage people to take a look at the NSTAC report and just really consume and internalize that 5-step model. It will work for you.
Excellent. Thank you, John. And along those lines, we're working on sort of elaborating that a little bit in some of the CSA documentation as well, a couple that are under development, sort of summarizing the whole 5-step process. And then we plan on doing some deep dive guidance to each one of the 5 steps. We're definitely going to be asking you to help us review those and make sure that they're accurate and hit all the high points. So as you mentioned, step 1 is defining the zero trust protect surface. And Shruti, in one of her work groups, has been looking at this methodology closely and developing some guidance on that that's fairly far along, where that should be available in advance of the Zero Trust Summit. So would you be willing to dive in a little bit on what that means and give us a preview of the guidance we're going to be offering?
Thank you, Eric. And yes, of course. So to build on top of what John, JJ, and Jason have been talking about, organizations try to protect something. So it could be data, it could be various other aspects. So for want of better word, I'll address your question in 2 parts. One is, what is it that the organization is trying to protect? And the second one is how it is trying to protect. So the first one is about what it is trying to protect. Normally people think about in terms of data like PII, PCI, or PHI. Well, those are data that one tries to protect, but the definition of data is much wider than just PCI, PII, or PHI, because for example, an organization that is into providing identity, an identity provider that actually helps in federating identities between various organizations, their data would be identity, not just PCI or PII data. Or taking another example, an organization that is into providing software products, their data would be in terms of code base. So when we put all these together, the organization, when they try to see what is it that they're trying to protect and ensure that it is not exfiltrated, so it includes whatever is important for that business, and that may be code base, it could be identity, it could be data, it could be just configuration data as well. So having talked about that, all these data elements, they do not live in vacuum. They need a house to live in. And that's where the asset comes into picture. So if we are trying to protect whatever we are trying to protect, we need to protect the asset that it lives in. And that's the first part of what we define as DAS elements, that is data, assets, applications, and services. Now, having said that, obviously the data part of it is accessed by the end users using applications. for example, an application that provides interface to banking data. Now, if the applications are not secured and a SQL injection materializes on the application, then no matter how strongly you have secured your assets, it doesn't really help. So we need to protect the applications as well. And extending on top of that, there are services that the data, the assets, the applications consume. For example, the DNS servers. So if the DNS servers or private DNS zone fails for an organization, then nobody would be able to reach out to the data that they're supposed to consume. So this is what I would define as data, and then the protect surface, and this is what the organization seeks to secure.
Excellent. Thank you, Shruti. So Jason, could you talk a little bit about some of the key concepts and guidance for the 5-step implementation, particularly in large organizations where you can't eat the elephant all at once?
I'm not sure we should be eating the elephants, but we'll put the metaphor aside.
Right.
Yeah, so the key is really to start something that's focused and to do it in a way that is let you be incremental, let you iterate on things to improve, and to do it in a way that's non-disruptive. And I like the example that Shruti gave, because you think about the data that sits there, and there's so many different ways that it can be accessed. It can be accessed directly in the database. It is accessed through an application. There might be some other services like a backup and recovery service that accesses the data in some fashion. And you need to pick your protect surface and build it out from there. So rather than saying, hey, we're going to control all access to this data, pick one, and you'd say, all right, we're going to focus on the application access to the data. Great. It's only accessible through this application server that houses a business logic. That's easy to control from a network flow. It's only accessed by these users or these groups of users who are authenticated, and we can validate their devices. That's easy to protect. And then you can set up your Kipling type policy around this in terms of data through the applications to these users, if they're in this group, if their device is valid, et cetera. Then you can iterate on that and say, fantastic, now let's control the backup system's access to this data. Now let's control access to the database by database administrators. And as you build on that, you're improving your security across the board, and you're doing it in a way that is rapid, can rapidly deliver value, is either valuable or non-disruptive to the business, and lets you improve and build on that and to get some momentum for your Zero Trust project.
Excellent. Thank you. And JJ, are there any particular challenges and nuances related to 5-step method applicable to OT, IoT?
Well, I mean, like John mentioned, they're all 5 steps are completely applicable. I would maybe just give the umbrella comment that they can be a lot more challenging. I mean, if we look at just a couple here, starting with defining the protect surface, which is just understanding the assets, like Shruti was saying, whether it's, the data and applications components, or in operational technology and a lot of critical infrastructure, we have those cyber physical assets that are, maybe eventually even an analog component with something physically moving in space. And the way that those things are built into the environment and the way that they are normally segmented, whether it's from the IT network or following something like the Purdue model, we don't do this well on the IT side, and we do an even crappier job on the OT side. So certainly in critical infrastructure, there's a lot of opportunity, whether it's manufacturing, utilities, et cetera, for us to get a better handle on keeping an asset inventory that's a lot more dynamic and has more fields. So whether it's a CMD, CMDB, or it's a spreadsheet, whatever it is we're using, we need something that's more robust and that we can hopefully update in real time and then plug into these other elements for these trust inferences and other data sets. Getting into mapping the transaction flows, I think John alluded to earlier, in a lot of the models we use in this space, there are concepts of zones and conduits that map very nicely to this model of understanding what each of these things is communicating to and from, and how, and under what circumstances, to Shruti's point, so that you understand what you need to protect and then how. And that, again, is substantially more challenging in a space where you have, traditionally the operators of this equipment are exceptionally bright, but they're brilliant in their domain, which is not information technology or information security. They're running around with hard hats in rugged environments. So again, something we don't really, having done thousands of implementations in the IT side as well for hundreds of organizations. We don't do this well already. So we have some other hurdles. And then you get into, you know, steps 3, 4, and 5, where we're talking about actually building out a zero trust architecture, the policies, monitoring and maintain it. Again, we already are starting with very poor visibility. We have a lot of assets we can't necessarily load our typical visibility agents into. We can't monitor and manipulate traffic the same ways at the network layer if we're talking about on-prem. And now we have the added challenges of, you know, again, we'll talk about this in November, but we have our use cases and the technology is maturing, and we've got to kind of drag this legacy stuff along with it, and get to a point where we can use these more modern technologies.
So now we're dragging the rock along with us, right? Instead of rolling it down the hill.
Really, one of the analogies I like is sort of pushing the rope up a hill, but
Yeah.
fun exercise. Yeah, so in the OT space, it really pushes the envelope of what we think about protecting to stuff that normal IT folks don't even think about. It could be anything from a gas pipeline compressor to a production line to a jet plane, right?
I've done a wind farm before.
Wind farms, yep.
Yeah, I mean, that's crazy. That was fun trying to figure that out. So, but you know, it just fit within the model, right? So everything in Zero Trust is designed to be flexible enough that it can meet the needs of your specific thing, instead of you making your specific thing fit into the way that somebody else has designed the system. And so that was, to me, as an engineer, when I first started out in this business, here's the architecture that you're going to deploy, but that's not going to work for the business, right? This is not, how do I do this? And well, but you got to do it that way, and because vendor X says so. And so we can just get away from that kind of stuff and make it meet the needs of the business, because then they can be the champions, and instead of dragging the rock, we roll the rock and surf the rock. I like surfing the rock, although I think that feels like one of those guys who roll logs on the water, you know, in those competitions. That seems like you got to move your feet pretty fast there, Jason.
And then wear a lot of plaid, but I think you're right. It's interesting is that everything is digitized, and what we're doing in security is, if we're building an automated model that allows or disallows access, that we literally have to have, therefore, a security model of the entire organization and how things work. And that's why it has to be adaptable to the business with, you know, with some incremental changes versus forcing the business to align with how my vendor architecture happens to work.
Yep, absolutely. So there's a lot more we could talk about, and we will be resuming these conversations in November at a Zero Trust Summit. You know, we talked a little bit about how our CSA research has been evolving and new things coming in the pipeline. Shruti's been doing some interesting work, and she spoke about it at our September event in context-based access control policies. There's also, with any major industry trend, there's a lot of misconceptions and hype cycles and all that. So there's a lot of things we could be talking about there, but we're almost out of time. So rather than diving in on those things, we'll just do a quick go around for any closing observations or conclusions or advice. You start with Shruti?
I think Zero Trust is a way of thinking and a way of working. So it need not be complex. It need not be complicated. I think it's the first thing to do is to start on the journey, identify a product surface as per the risk that one foresees for the organization, and to proceed with it. That's very important. So I would say that, yes, start your journey, don't delay on it, adopt it, evolve it, and embrace it.
And learn as you go, right?
Absolutely.
Jason?
I think Zero Trust represents the collection of best practices and approaches in terms of how we are performing and delivering security today. And I think that as cybersecurity professionals, as information security professionals, we have a responsibility to push and pull and drag our organization forward. So I encourage everyone to let's get going. Let's advance our organizations, and remember that this can help you grow professionally as well, because this is how we do things today. This is the way.
Excellent. Thank you. JJ?
Yeah, I'll just add that I want to keep a little bit of context here, because for a lot of us have worked with large organizations. I think all of us have worked with Fortune-sized organizations down well into the mid-market. And of course, there's a lot of small businesses floating around out there. And, way less than 1% of the companies have more than 5,000 employees. So part of this is, there's a lot of confusion. We've got speed bumps on the road to adoption and maturation of zero trust projects. There's a lot of lack of clarity about it. And some of this is partially attributed to the vendors, what I would maybe say is voracious appetite for including buzzwords in their portfolio. So they're not really helping us. They're taking everything we were buying 18 months ago, just now is marked up 18% and has zero trust in the name. And so a lot of the consumers of that are confused, and a lot of organizations don't necessarily have the people resources or the financial resources to understand this. But they don't necessarily understand zero trust and what it means in their environment. And I think that's our opportunity, because as John and Jason and Trudy have been sharing, this is one of the things we can do that we can fit in our budget. We can maybe even use less budget, be more secure, and reduce the user friction. So that's the things I think is a takeaway for everybody, is it doesn't matter what size you are. This is the appropriate architecture for you.
Excellent. Thank you. And John?
Yeah, I would say the final thought here is kind of rounding all this stuff up, is you don't have to, wherever you are, you can start. There's no prerequisites. Everybody's kind of has a lot of fear of doing new things, but because, as Jason says, it's incremental, iterative, and non-disruptive, you can't screw things up very much. But as one customer of mine said, we spent more time arguing about zero trust than we did deploying the first zero trust environment. So because it's a different way of doing things, people are a little bit afraid of that. So get yourself some management or executive sponsorship that's going to start that rock going down the hill, and then you can just come in behind it, and there'll be a nice pathway, because big rocks make nice paths. And so wherever you are, that's where you are. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to solve every problem. You just start somewhere and you'll learn. And so that's my main recommendation to people.
Excellent. Thank you, John. So in closing, I'd like to thank everybody for their time today and invite you to come participate, join our Zero Trust working groups, check out our events like the upcoming Zero Trust Summit, and also our online Zero Trust training. So, and thanks everybody, and thank you very much to our panelists for your time today.